We'll make sure it's functioning correctly and go from there. Let's see. I don't know if, let's see if the audio is working. 1, 2, is it? No?
It's on.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Looks like it's all working. All right, so we'll stand, we'll say our prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, Word of word present, fullest of all things, the treasury of good things, giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So, welcome back. I hope it's all working and everybody can hear me. Tonight we are, this is lecture 23 of 25. Does it look like the audio is working, Deacon Michael? Or has it died?
It's working. I turned it down.
It's okay? Okay. I'm just not seeing the audio signal there on the computer, so. Very good. All right. It's good that the video is delayed so I can hear myself. Since last week, we had half of the lesson cut off, and I had to re-record half of it. So let's see how we do tonight. So tonight, we're talking about the 19th century, and I kind of subtitled it, The Beginning of the World That We Live In. Because in many ways, the world we live in has its history. So, but we got to get there first. But we're going to start with Russia, the Russian monarchy, and what's going on in Russia at this point in the 19th century. But to get there, we need to go back a little bit to the previous century, how Western influence affected the Russian monarchy, and through the Russian monarchy, the rest of Russia. Because it's the Russian monarchs that willingly come under Western influence and then disseminate that throughout their empire. So, of course, you have Jesuits going east to do missionary work. The Polish-Lithuania sits next to the Russian Empire, and their borders continually move around and overlap. And so you have Russian speakers who are Orthodox within the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And one of the first major kind of figures at this that shows us the Western influence is the Metropolitan of Kiev, Peter Mogila, who dies in 1646. He is a defender of Orthodoxy, very, very faithful to his church, but he's influenced by trends in the West. And he organizes the new Orthodox Kievan Academy along Western lines, adopting scholastic forms of theology to teach, in a sense. In a sense, the form of the school is Western. Very much so, with the inclusion of course, Orthodox liturgical practices and so forth, and worship and tradition, but reading of certain patristic fathers from the East. But also this is combined with the influence of Thomistic theology of Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics. Our author, Father Strickland, in his volume, The Age of Utopia, he says, Orthodoxy among Russians now became increasingly clericalistic and formalistic. Deacon Michael, clericalistic clergy. In a sense, there was a greater time into Russia, specifically the Russian Empire. Also, tonight we're going to read from Christos Giannaros's Orthodoxy in the West. But the first quote here is not Giannaros himself, but Father George Florovsky is quoted here. in the text. Father George Florovsky is a priest and a scholar of the 20th century from Russia. He did most of his work in the United States, taught at Princeton, and at Princeton, as well as Emirs, Holy Cross, other places. And this is what Father George Florovsky, how he addresses Peter Mogila. He says he was, quote, an avid and resolute Westernizer. In dogma, he was privately, so to speak, already at one with the Holy See, meaning Rome. He was quite ready to accept what he found in Roman books as traditional and orthodox. That is why in theology and in worship, Mogila could freely adopt Latin material. It has been argued that Mogila sought to create an occidental orthodoxy, and thereby to disentangle orthodoxy from its absolute Oriental setting. The notion is plausible. True, he found the church in ruins and had to rebuild. But he built a foreign edifice on the ruins. He founded a Roman Catholic school in the church, and for generations the Orthodox clergy was raised in a Roman Catholic spirit and taught theology in Latin. He Romanized the liturgies and thereby Latinized the mentality and the psychology, the very soul of the Orthodox people. Mogila's internal toxin, so to speak, was far more dangerous than the unia. The unia could be resisted and had been resisted, especially when there was efforts to enforce it. Mogila's Romanism entered silently and imperceptibly with almost no resistance. The unia, remember, is a term to refer to those who were Orthodox who joined union with Rome in 1596 at the Council of Brest. And they retained, in a sense, outwardly everything that was Orthodox, but the thing they changed was the bishop they were under. And slowly they were Latinized in terms of their theology and so forth. But he says it was easier to resist the unia, especially when the Polish-Lithuanian Empire was trying to enforce that on Orthodox people, than what Peter Mogila did. In a sense, I would say his intention might have been right, but his influence, he had been influenced, and that was detrimental going forward for the church in Russia.
Did he do that purposely, Father, or was he just educated that way, so that's what he thought Orthodoxy was?
I don't know for sure, but I would side on the speculation that this was not, in a sense, he was not trying to do something intentionally coercive. This was not his intention to subvert. In a sense, this is how he was formed, and he brought what he knew with him into a very important position in the church, and through that was able to spread, in a sense, what was influenced, how he was, influenced himself. So, but that's Father Florovsky's take on Peter Mogila. I know there are various different opinions about him in the church, but that was Father George Florovsky's take on the effect of Peter Mogila. Iconography also was influenced along Renaissance lines at this time, and this is where you get churches, as we know today, many of them with iconography that is very much in the Baroque style or the classical style, the more naturalistic. And this also then brings us to Peter the Great, who lived reigned 1682 to 1725. He is, I wouldn't say not the first Westernizing monarch, but very much the most important of the early period. He had a new capital built called St. Petersburg in a completely Baroque style, the style of the Renaissance, trying to reproduce the majesty of the French capital in Versailles, which he himself visited. Preferring modest lodging for himself, though, he disliked formalities. He could hold more liquor than anyone at court. He admired and was inspired by the French, the court of Louis XIV. He was a westernizer by force. He was known to forcibly shave the beards of his nobles at court, because a beard was seen as, in a sense, backwards by Western culture at times. He was not a pious man. He did not appreciate orthodoxy, in a sense, for its efficacious and its ability to bring him close to God, but he appreciated it, like a number of Western monarchs, for its potential in ruling his empire, being a unifying force within the kingdom. And this shows how much he was a man of the Enlightenment, kind of taking on the attitudes of the Enlightenment, which were contempt for ritual, contempt for miracles, contempt for asceticism and monasticism, and hierarchy. These are things that spread throughout the Enlightenment thinkers. In 1700, at the death of the Patriarch of Moscow, he declined to name a successor, and instead instituted what he called the Holy Synod, made up of a handful of bishops, but led by a layman called the chief procurator, to run the church to the benefit of the state. Peter's immediate successors followed his westernizing policies. The most significant of those who come after him that continue this westernizing trend is Catherine the Great, reigning 1762 to 1796. We will turn to Father John Strickland to tell us a little bit about her. He says, art and secularization were also prominently linked at the court of Catherine the Great. She had come to power unexpectedly. She was the Lutheran daughter of a German prince, because remember the monarchy and the hierarchy, or the monarchy within all of Europe, they all intermarried with one another. It was, in many places, by law, you could only marry someone of nobility. And in the Holy Roman Empire, you had a plethora of small principalities, of small kingdoms, filled with princes and dukes and kings and so forth, under the Holy Roman Emperor. And so it was from those Germanic principalities that, in a sense, you had the biggest selection of a bride, because there were so many. And many kings would marry from, in a sense, that collection of nobility from what becomes, Germany, but was at this time the Holy Roman Empire. And so Catherine is one of these. Lutheran daughter of a German prince. She had been married to Tsar Peter III while he was still only the heir. She soon learned to detest her husband, who by virtue of both his youth and his temperament proved himself grotesquely immature. He continued to play with toy soldiers well into their marriage and gave more attention to military drills than to domestic relations. It took him no fewer than 12 years to consummate the marriage. In the meantime, the intelligent and ambitious young princess alternated her time between lovers and the works of the French philosophers. Under these influences, she became a deist and began to plan for how she might rule Russia alone as a progressive monarch. When Peter finally acceded to the throne, she swiftly arranged a palace coup that resulted in his arrest and summary execution. Catherine thus became the empress of Russia in her own right. Her reign was in many ways the fulfillment of Peter the Great's, and as a result, posterity bestowed on her the same epithet, the Great. Catherine the Great shared her predecessor's contempt for the old Christendom and the Orthodox Church's influence on Russian culture, erecting a famous statue of Peter, known as the Bronze Horseman, on the banks of the Neva. She advanced his policy of integrating Russia even more closely with the West. Her main achievements in this were cultural. She continued the building program of St. Petersburg, ordering the erection of palaces, churches, and schools. All were designed in the late Baroque or Rococo style to link the city with Rome and Paris. Her most famous architectural achievement was the expansion of the Winter Palace, situated on the Neva upstream from Peter's statue. She playfully called the annex her hermitage. But instead of prayer, the opulent structure was designed to support a growing collection of secular paintings like no other in the world. And you can visit the Hermitage there today, and it has, I think, the largest collection of art in the world. No icons, though, at least in Catherine's day. But instead of, needless to say, the Hermitage did not display icons or any other forms of native Russian art. Only Western European works produced since the Quattrocento were cataloged in its vast expanses. Like Peter's efforts to turn Russia into a mighty European military force, Catherine's promotion of the arts aimed to make her adopted homeland more like the culture she had left behind in Germany. In this, she followed in the first steps of the philosophy of San Sochi. A wise philosopher, Tsaritsa herself, she too corresponded with Voltaire and d'Alembert. She consumed the great treatises on government by Montesquieu and Beccari. And though Petersburg was thrice as far from Paris as Potsdam, she matched Frederick's protection of Rousseau by inviting the celebrated Diderot to her capital when his encyclopedia began to face censorship problems. Remember, we mentioned both Rousseau and Diderot in last week's lecture on the Enlightenment. These are fathers of the Enlightenment. Catherine kept herself well appraised of the policies of other absolute monarchs in Europe. Like Joseph II, she held monasticism in high contempt. In 1764, she actually anticipated and exceeded Josephinism by seizing the Orthodox Church's monastic lands and dissolving nearly 2/3 of all monasteries. Remember, we mentioned how Joseph II had seized monasteries in Austria. By this time, the hierarchy had been completely demoralized, meaning the hierarchy of the church. By the absence of an autonomous patriarchate. What is more, the long-term effect of dissolving independent sketes like those of the 16th century non-possessors, in which hesychasm had flourished, was that that wealthy monasteries of scale were easily targeted for state appropriation. As in the case of Peter's abolition of the patriarchate, a complaint and spiritually weakened hierarchy thus failed to resist its deistic sovereign. Only one bishop of note objected, Metropolitan Arseny of Rostov, who died in 1772. He denounced Catherine's land seizure and condemned the hierarchs of the Holy Synod as guard dogs who passively watched the theft of the church without barking. Arseny paid dearly for his independence. He was arrested on Catherine's orders, dragged before the Synod for trial, and summarily thrown into prison where he was subsequently starved to death. Needless to say, when Catherine issued an ambitious but abortive instruction to convey a special commission representing all elements of Russian society to consider how progressive reforms might be introduced, the clergy were not invited.
Father, it seems to me then that Orthodoxy would not have been a really strong belief in the people, because I would think that they would have uprised against her.
You have to remember that at this point, life of an average citizen is so far removed from the life of the monarch and in a sense, the nobility in many ways, that life in the village goes on in many ways unchanged and not very much affected. It's only in the great cities and in the academies, right? In what becomes called the intelligentsia, that these things penetrate Russian society. amongst, in a sense, the peasants and the middle class. In a sense, even in the time of Catherine the Great, the westernization of culture doesn't penetrate that deeply. It's in the nobility, which is a problem, and in the educated class, in the leaders, but it doesn't, in a sense, percolate down to that depth.
I would think the closing of so many monasteries would have been a huge red flag to all these people.
Yeah,
From that.
yeah, and you see one bishop, one of the metropolitans, raising a stink about it and dying for that. So I think he would have represented other sentiment, but again, in the villages and so forth, the people would definitely be bewildered, but the question of what you do, right? They don't have social media or the news media provoking them to do anything, right? It has to be organic uprising. It can't be something kind of stoked by, the media in any way. So, or it has to be, these things have to be disseminated through literature, books, pamphlets, right? Because that's how the Protestant Reformation picked up steam, because of pamphleteering. Simple pamphlets that communicated the message that was touching a nerve that was in society already, and then these things happen. But in Russia, it wasn't the same context. So but at the same time of Catherine, it's Catherine the Great who authorizes the missionaries to Alaska, including St. Herman of Alaska. So you have, in the time of Catherine, in her reign, this overlaps with the early life and midlife, the early life and work of not just St. Herman, but also St. Seraphim of Sarov. So you can see, in a sense, in the culture, Orthodoxy still is very much prevalent and penetrating to be able to produce, in a sense, such saintly men from the monastic ranks, even though not all monasteries are closed, but many are, especially the smaller ones. So, but you still have a liveliness in the faith that's able to, give us saints like St. Seraphim and St. Herman, who comes to North America, to Alaska. So after, though, Catherine, in our time period, you have Alexander the First, the Blessed. That's an epithet applied to him. He is emperor from 1801 to 1825. It's he that defeats Napoleon in the French Empire's invasion of Russia. It's in his reign that Napoleon is defeated. Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, he reigns during the Crimean War, which we'll talk about. Alexander III, 1855 to 1881. Alexander III, 1881 to 1894. And then Saint Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, who was also a saint, 1894 to 1917. We won't cover him really tonight. We'll be talking about him next week. But in the czars that come in the 19th century, they've been influenced, like the westernization has happened, but in the 19th century, you have also, in a sense, this hearkening back to what Russia has been, a longing back to the past. And so the 18th century is very much a westernizing period, but the 19th century is a pulling back in many ways of that, to the point where you get to Tsar Nicholas II, who is very much, in a sense, turning away from the West in many ways to the Eastern heritage of the Russian people during his reign. And so you can see this movement going on within the empire. And so it's also in the 19th century that you get the great hierarchs of Russia, St. Philaret of Moscow, St. Innocent, who is first the Bishop of Alaska, but eventually becomes the Metropolitan of Moscow in 1867. He succeeds St. Philaret of Moscow, 1821 to 1867, is his long reign in the 19th century. So It's also the era of the Orthodox missionary work, not just in Alaska, but the work of people like St. Nicholas of Japan, who begins his missionary efforts in around 1860 in Japan. And the Orthodox Church in Japan, in a sense, lends its origin to his work in the 19th century. And of course, and so this is the movement going on in the 19th century within Russia, very much this within the nobility and the intelligentsia and so forth. This internal conflict of who are we? And this is exemplified, of course, in the works of Dostoevsky. In his fictional works, you see, in a sense, the internal struggle going on, and a beautiful example of Orthodox spirituality as well as Enlightenment thinking in the works of Dostoevsky, all occurring in Russia. So the 19th century also, though, begins with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the aftermath of the French Revolution, which we talked about last week. Just for a note, the First French Republic lasts from 1792 to 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte establishes the First Russian Empire, 1804 to 1815. And it's in 1815 that Napoleon is defeated. 1815 to 1830 is the period called the Bourbon Restoration. And you have the monarchy restored 1830 to 1848. And then you have the Second Republic, 1848 to 1852. Then the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870. Then the Third Republic, 1870 to 1940. And so you see in France, right, the fruit of the Enlightenment, right? Again, there is this swinging back and forth, right, between the Enlightenment ideals of the Republic, exemplified in the Republic, and pulling back to the more traditional form of society in the empires, with monarchies and so forth, and this kind of flailing of society, right? Which is very, a lot of people suffered and died in the midst of all this movement. But that typifies what's going on in France at this point in the 19th century. We'll have to leave them kind of there. We'll come back to them when we get to the Crimean War. But also then we turn to what's going on in the Balkan Peninsula, specifically Greece, because it's in 1821 that we mark Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. And so, but we need a little background to how do we get here. Of course, the Ottoman conquest of the Balkan Peninsula occurs largely in the 15th century, and this leads to a very dark age for the Orthodox people of that area, an age of cultural decay, which is averted by the presence of the church amongst the people. It's the thing that holds civilization together. The common faith of the people is the thing that that unites them and keeps this common identity of who they are. But this got to its low point in the 18th century, and if it wasn't for people like St. Cosmos Aeolus, in many ways, we would not have Greece or Greek speakers, because it's St. Cosmos who, in his life, he dies in 1779, in the midst of the American Revolution, is when he dies. He, a monk from Mount Athos, leaves the Holy Mountain with the blessing of the Patriarch of Constantinople to go amongst the people to preach. And not just to preach the gospel, but also to establish schools to teach the Greek language, because the Greek people were losing their language to speaking Turkish. So he established schools wherever he preached to prevent as well as reverse the Turkification of the Greek people, and its future generations. His primary territory was in the regions of Epirus, Macedonia, and Albania. At the time, the majority of the Greek people were illiterate due to a lack of schools, and education was seen as an essential tool in recovering their identity, remembering their history, and continuing their traditions. This eventually would help lead to the Greek Revolution of 1821, because it's, in a sense, many say it's St. Cosmos who's the father of the, in a sense, the Greek nation. Because his work brought the people back to an understanding of who they were. But the Greeks also were influenced by the Reformation and the Enlightenment, which affected the formation of the Greek state in the 19th century. And so I'm going to go back to Jan Ross, Orthodoxy in the West, and read a section here about the Greek Revolution and the Greek independence. Jan Ross, of course, a Greek himself of the 20th century. Let's see, find the right page. Greek independence from the Turks after 400 years of servitude was the result of the living Christian faith of the people and was achieved to a large extent by the clergy. The sources, especially the memoirs of the revolutionaries themselves, make this abundantly clear. Social and economic factors were also important, but did not distract from the political and religious aims. According to Macrianus, the Greeks wanted to, quote, live as human beings in their own country with their own religion. The country's national identity was defined by its religion. The ideological interpretations of the revolutionaries' motives that have been fashionable for some time cannot overturn the evidence of the sources. Enlightenment revolutionary ideas influenced Western educated intellectuals, but not the peasants. Again, the same contrast. You have the intellectuals, and then you have the common people. The intellectuals who largely are influenced by the West. The peasants are not. Merchants, so not the peasants, merchants, sailors, and their leaders who did the fighting. They fought in the name of the Orthodox faith, which differentiated them from them nationally. Greekness was identified with Orthodoxy, which set them apart from the Muslim Turk and the heterodox Frank. At the start of the war, people put their hopes for external aid in Orthodox Russia, as they had done for centuries, not in Europe. The clergy were their natural leaders. As a rule, a cleric would call on the people to rise in the name of the faith and the motherland. Monasteries often became supply centers and command posts or a haven for refugees and the wounded. Bishops and priests, together with the captains, summoned the revolutionary war councils and often fought in the front line. They acted as officials in the new local administration and participated in the first national assemblies. There was Germanos of Old Patras, Theodoretos of Vresthenes, Isaias of Salonoi, Joseph of Andrusa, Neophytos of Talention, Procopius of Kerniki, Joseph of Rogoi, Gregory of Methon, Cyril of Corinth, Daniel of Tripolis, Dionysius of Rion, together with Gregory Dikaios, Paphalesus, and Athanasius Diakos. But there were countless other, many unknown. More himself estimated that 80 bishops were killed during the revolution, and as well as hundreds of priests. When the revolution spread and hopes began to grow for its success, the clergy and the captains began to be marginalized in the search for more effective political control. The new leaders were ambitious to organize the struggle and the new state. They included former primates, powerful ship owners, Phanuriates. The Phanuriates, remember, were the people that lived right around the Patriarch of Constantinople, in the district of Phanuria, or the Phanar. And they then also were the kind of economic powerhouse of the Greek people and had locations, eventually other places, such as in the Danubian principalities. And so it was the Phanariots from the Danubian principalities and intellectuals from the European diaspora. They needed to impress Europeans with an image of a people rising against a barbarous tyranny and seeking their natural place among civilized nations. These Western criteria would dominate the new state. From the start, the Greek state modeled its social and political institutions on the West. The dreams and ambitions of the fighters themselves became irrelevant. Respect for ancient social and political traditions seemed less important than the assertion that Greece was a modern European nation. The imposition of a new perspective was neither easy nor painless. After 1824, the revolutionary leadership became divided. The old primates demanded a decentralized traditional form of government, while the Westernizers would not give way on the idea of a strong centralized state. Within the basic division of outlook, there were many other causes of disagreement. The factionalism of the captains who were ignored by the politicians, the interests of the ship owners and powerful primates, and fierce local loyalties. Consequently, after the Turks had been driven from their strongholds in just 2 years, the revolution degenerated into a bloody civil war. The Turks regained control of most areas. But for the next 4 years, the Greeks had no concern for anything but their fratricidal conflicts. It was the intervention of the European powers that ensured the liberation of some Greek lands as an independent state. Without them, the revolution of 1821 would probably had suffered the same fate as the Orlov Rebellion of 1768 to 74, or the Alexander Upsilantis invasion of Moldo-Wallachia in the spring of 1821. The intervention of England, France, and Russia was decided by the Treaty of London on July 6, 1827, on the initiative of the British Foreign Minister George Canning. He proposed a compromise to the Greeks and the Turks, an autonomous Greek state subject to the Sultan with the imposition of an armistice by the three powers. The Greeks accepted the proposal, but the Turks did not, and the Allied fleets were ordered to cut off supplies to Ibrahim, the viceroy of Egypt, whose well-organized forces were crushing resistance in the Peloponnese. On October 2nd, 1827, the Turco-Egyptian fleet was totally destroyed at the Battle of Navarino on the initiative of an English admiral who decided to interpret his orders to cut off supplies to the Egyptians in a proactive manner. The Battle of Navarino implemented de facto the European provisions for an independent Greek state. Because of the influence of the West, Western powers, Greece became economically dependent on the West, and this has never ended to this day. If you just follow late 20th century Greek politics, the economic issues are always at the top, and their dependency on the European Union. Political instability fed by French, British, and Russian interference marked the initial days of the modern nation-state of Greece. By treaty of May 7, 1832, England, France, and Russia guaranteed with Bavaria the independence of Greece and appointed Otto Wittelsbach, Roman Catholic boy of 16 years old, son of Ludwig, King of Bavaria, as monarch. By agreement, his father appointed a three-man regency of 1 Catholic and 2 Protestants to rule until he came of age. It was an absolute monarchy with no constitution, backed by 3,500 Bavarian troops. A European state administration was set up, including those Greeks affiliated with French and British supported political parties, but those Greeks supported by Russia were excluded from the government. Greece was organized along Bavarian lines in government, education, military, and the church. New construction was all along neoclassical lines, shunning anything that was from the Dark Age or Byzantine, which affected also iconography and the style, just like in Russia. Very much Renaissance style iconography became predominant. What had occurred in Russia was paralleled in Greece. The autocephaly of the Church of Greece in March of 1833 was declared by a government committee of 7 members, 4 laymen and 3 bishops. It resulted in a schism from the Patriarch of Constantinople, who historically was the senior hierarch of that area, who rejected the autocephaly, and this schism lasted until 1850. Now I'm going to turn to Philip Sherrard, his comments about this period. In 1833, a synod, in fact, summoned by the Greek government. Its purpose was to discuss and vote on the government's proposals to bring the Church in Greece under the control of the state. One of the proposals was that the Church in Greece should separate itself from the Patriarchate of Constantinople and establish its autocephaly. Autocephaly meaning self-governance or self-headed. In the afternoon of the day on which the synod met, it voted in favor of this proposal and so severed a connection which had lasted for 11 centuries. Some days later, the Greek government issued a new ecclesiastical constitution, largely the work of the regent, George von Maurer, a German Protestant, heavily dependent on legal training obtained in Napoleonic France, ably assisted by Theoklitos Pharmakides, a priest who derived his views on ecclesiastical matters largely from German Protestant thought and the works of Koreus, the works of Koreus. Article 1 of the new ecclesiastical constitution reads, "The Orthodox Eastern Apostolic Church of the Kingdom of Greece in spiritual matters recognizes no head other than the founder of the Christian faith, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, while in secular affairs it recognizes the authority of the King of Greece. It is autocephalous and independent of all other authority." Article 2 reads, "The highest ecclesiastical authority is entrusted under the authority of the King to a permanent synod entitled the Holy Synod of the Kingdom of Greece. The King was determined by an organic decree. The King will determine by an organic decree of the Secretary of State who will exercise the authority and under whom, as regards this authority, the Synod will act." The year was 1833, which happened to be the 300th anniversary of Henry VIII of England's Act in Restraint of Appeals, enunciating the theory of a church and state that found their point of union in the king, who was to be the head of both church and state. The Henrysian changes, which formed the basis of the English Reformation and denied the papacy all rights of jurisdiction over the church in England, subverted the medieval idea of the church and state as 2 aspects of one community. For this idea, they substituted the idea that the state is the dominant partner in the alliance. The Greek form of Erastianism, the doctrine of the ascendancy of the state over the church, established by the church settlement of 1833, did much the same. It reduced the church in Greece to a department of the state and its officers to little more than functionaries in the government bureaucracy. The ecclesiastical charter will be in force until 1923, when the Plasteris Revolution abolishes it, but will be reinstated in 1925. In August of 1833, the Holy Synod seized all monastery lands that housed fewer than 3 monks, selling them to fund the clergy stipend and the maintenance of schools. Then in September, this was applied to monasteries with fewer than 6 monks, and dismissing all novices and nuns under the age of 40 from their monasteries. Sacred vessels were seized and sold. Vestments, icons, liturgical books, and other sacred objects were sold or destroyed, burning them in the courtyards of their monastery. Of the 563 monasteries in the new Greek state, 412 were dissolved. 3 women's monasteries survived this. Roman Catholic monasteries and lands were not touched. Resistance began from some of the clergy, two metropolitans, Ioannikios of Rhythnin and Gerasimos of Adrianople, who fled to Constantinople to escape arrest, but the resistance by lay people was far more widespread. The next 25 years would be marked by uprisings against the, quote, Catholic king and the, quote, Luthero-Calvinists who govern us and, quote, the Frankish Synod. Through Otto's reign, Protestant missionaries were active through foreign embassies, establishing schools used for proselytism. Publications were established, and at least 112 texts were appointed as school textbooks. The missionaries introduced Sunday school to Greece. Remember, Sunday school is a Protestant invention. And in 1836, 45,000 Protestant translations were published in Greece that year alone. Three of the most prominent opponents to the subversion of the church were the priest Konstantinos Oikonomos, the monk Christophoros Papoulakos, and the layman Cosmas Flamiatos. Also, you have the example of the general Yanis Makrianis, who lived 1797 to 1864. He's been mentioned already, Makrianis. He was a hero of the War of Independence and led an uprising on September 3rd of 1843, which forced King Otto to grant Greece a constitution. But he also led a secret life of prayer, an ascetical life akin to the Hesychast tradition of St. Gregory Palamas and the monks that came before him, which this was only later discovered when his memoirs and his notebook were discovered in 1907. His rites of prayer leading to vision of the uncreated light and the grace of God. He's also considered one of the masters of modern Greek prose. Very fascinating. And that example of Makrianis is one. Also, you have the example of the Greek Dostoevsky, Alexander Papadiamantis, who is seen as the greatest writer of Greece in the 19th and early 20th century, surpassing Makrianis. Papadiamantis lived from 1851 to 1911. And in his works, you have the embodying in their fictional writing of the Orthodox understanding of reality. Permeates. This is what you see in Dostoevsky and in Papadiamantis. I'm going to read a very short section here by Yana Ross about Papadiamantis. Papadiamantis is the most important and most authentic modern Greek theologian, precisely because he alone rediscovered the basic presupposition of the church's gospel, that we know God by cultivating a relationship, not by understanding a concept. Our relationship with God becomes immediate and perceptible through the ascetic practice of the ecclesial community, through abandoning the imagined self-sufficiency of individual pleasure. This is what you see embodied in his fictional characters. That we know God directly. It's not about understanding concepts, but actually knowing God. And that we know God through the ascetical life in the church, the prayer, the fasting, the almsgiving, the things, the worship life of the church, all of these things that were maintained throughout, in a sense, this dark period and then in the westernizing age, right? It's the worship life of the church, in a sense, that held together the faith or taught the faith to the people right? In a sense, the intellectuals had been westernized, but the liturgy still taught the faith by your participation in it.
Did St. Nectarius live during that time?
St. Nectarius comes at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And we'll get to him because he dies in the 20th century, the 1920s. So he'll be next week. So, yeah. Also, the 19th century in Greece saw the rise of autonomous religious groups within Orthodoxy following Protestant models, brotherhoods and associations with secular recognition by the state, but outside the authority of the local bishop, which caused immense issues in Greece. Examples being several: Apostolos Makrakis and his Logos school and the things that kind of burgeoned out of it, including the later Zoe Brotherhood of theologians. All of both of those groups are somewhat controversial still to this day in Greece, and hotly debated of the value and the importance of them and so forth. But they both were heavily influenced by Protestant ideas. And then this brings us now to the middle point of the 19th century outside of Greece, and back to Russia, but also fought on the Crimean Peninsula. That's why it's called the Crimean War. But it didn't start because the cause was the great powers' disagreement over the status quo. You all know that phrase, the status quo, right? Where did it come from? The status quo was a term first used in the Treaty of Berlin, 1870, and who was the protector of the Christian people within the Ottoman Empire. Of the Crusades, control of the holy places in Palestine had been disputed due to the entrance of the Roman Catholics into historically Orthodox and non-Chalcedonian lands. During the First Crusade, the holy sites were taken from the Orthodox and the non-Chalcedonians, who had some of them, by the Roman Catholics. And once the Crusades ended, conflict arose over who would control the sites, with the Ottomans granting control usually based on who could pay the most. And it would change. Right? Remember, the Ottomans would grant a new patriarch based on who could pay the most. And this led to great instability for the Christians, the Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. This was another way that the church suffered in the Middle East because of the conflict, the competing desires of largely the Roman Catholics and coming in and competing for control of the holy places. Established who had control and who had access to them. Okay. This was first established 1757 when the Sultan issued a decree outlining who had control of which sites, which formed the basis of what came to be called the status quo. The French Emperor Napoleon III in the early 1500s, though, forced the Ottoman Empire to alter the status quo, recognizing France, not Russia, as the sovereign authority over the Christians in Palestine in general, and granting the Roman Catholic Church control of Christian holy places, those involved in the status quo. Russia had been the sovereign authority by two treaties of 1757 and 1774, and the control of the holy places had been defined and not to be changed. France, using gunboat diplomacy, they sent the ship called Line of Charlemagne to the Black Sea. And as well as likely financial inducements to convince the Ottoman Sultan to accept a new treaty, granting France and the Catholic Church supreme authority over holy places, including the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Several Orthodox monks died as a result of a conflict with French monks in Bethlehem. The Russian Tsar blamed the Ottoman Empire for allowing the change. Britain mediated at first a compromise with Tsar Nicholas I, who agreed to the compromise. But the Ottomans demanded changes to the compromise, and Nicholas refused any changes. Russia occupied the Danubian principalities on October 16th of 18 and negotiate. The Ottomans, though, declared war on Russia after having obtained support from France and Britain to do so. France and Britain declared war on Russia on the 27th and then the 28th of March, 1854, respectively. Austria also sided with the Ottomans. France and Britain, along with the Kingdom of Sardinia, would also enter the conflict physically. Russia would lose the conflict and sign the 7. In this, there was a latter Russo-Turkish war. The states of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained international of their independence, and Bulgaria achieved its autonomy from direct Ottoman rule. So now we turn to the last part, if you'll bear with me. The way we think, in terms of concepts we use, words we use to define reality, right? A number of these things arise in the 19th century. Father Stephen de Young, who we've read his work, The Religion of the Apostles, a few years ago. This is what he says. An area fraught with disagreement is the relationship of Christianity to what has been called paganism. The latter term, paganism, itself presents some difficulty, as it is a later coinage used to describe early practice it describes. And it gathers its Latin root, reverence for the gods, conscientiousness, sense of right, moral obligation, fear of the god, faith, a mode of worship, cult, sanctity, holiness. In the later Latin, this meaning up to the 5th, 6th century, it was a reference for monastic life. This is from, this next quote is from Michael Pasquier, Religion in America, the Basics. Religion is a modern concept. It is an idea with a history that developed, most scholars would agree, out of the social and cultural disruptions of Renaissance and Reformation Europe. From the 14th to the 17th century, at a time of unprecedented political transformation and scientific innovation, it became possible for people to differentiate between things religious and things not religious, as we described the arrival of the idea of secularism. Such a dualistic understanding of the world was simply not available in such clear terms to ancient and medieval Europeans, to say nothing of people from the continents of North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. Unquote. Before the Renaissance, a religious person was a monk or a nun, because they were part of a religious order. That's the context of how the word was used. It wasn't used to describe religion or religions. Western European scholars were debating the definition of what the word religion in the 19th century. And the modern use of the term is linked to the emergence of fields of study such as psychology, sociology, and cultural anthropology. So how we talk about religion, and this, of course, affects when you read the scriptures, right? Think of the book of James, chapter 1, verses 26 and 20, standard version. If any man thinketh himself to be religious, while he bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his heart, this man's religion is vain. Pure religion and undefiled before our God and Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. What does that mean? Right? The modern concept of religion does not apply here, because the Greek word there is no Greek word for religion. The 19th century gives us this idea of generic religion, or that there's this religion and that religion, and how we think of these things. This is the 19th century. Also, the terms polytheism and monotheism. These terms originate in the 17th century as terms, but become widespread in use in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, nobody's talking about the difference of monotheism to polytheism. No one's speaking about the three monotheistic religions. Nobody's thinking in those categories. This is not the concepts in which they function. This is, again, 19th century ways of polytheism. And actually that distinction, right, is inaccurate. We can't go into it right now, but in a sense, Orthodox Christianity doesn't exist in a world of monotheistic versus polytheistic religions. Terms outside of theology, such as homosexuality and heterosexuality, both terms are created by Karl Maria Kertbeny, a Hungarian journalist in the 1860s, to describe things that he's reporting on related to, in a sense, the sexual experiences of the people he is reporting on. He creates the words to distinguish behaviors. The terms themselves then become initially used in the new field of psychology to describe specifically sexual disorders. Both terms are initially used by psychologists to describe disorders. That's how they are initially used. It's only later that the words take on the meanings that we mostly think of them today. But this is a very, in a sense, recent phenomenon. Now we get to the question of race. And I'm going to read again from Don de Decadence by Jacques Barzun that I've mentioned once before. When Darwin and Huxley talked about favored races, meaning the surviving fittest, they were referring to the varieties of any animal species. But another group of scientists and publicists using the same words meant specifically varieties of men. The 19th century was the heyday of physical anthropology, which divided mankind into three or more races. It was taken for an exact science in spite of its conflicting statements. And it was also the playground of historians, social theorists, and politicians who survived the public with tomes, monographs, pamphlets, and magazine articles. The words Celt, Caucasian, Aryan, Saxon, Semite, Teutonic, Nordic, Latin, Negro, Hamitic, Alpine, Mediterranean, mingled with Cephalic Index, Dolicho, Brocchi, and Mesocephalic, and other technicalities of the laboratory. Mention has been made of what came before: the explorations of the 18th century, which supplied data about distant tribes, physically distinct, the early 19th century linguists launching of the Aryan language and, quote, race, the anatomists, phrenology, all these merged in or with the skull. For it was the skull, its bumps forgotten, because initially they thought that they could tell a lot from the bumps on your head through analyzing them, okay? But that being forgotten, the mid-century of the 19th century, anthropologists took as the diagnostic sign of the races, meaning the skull was a way of understanding the race of a person or the traits of a race. Yet in another quarter, there persisted the historians' loose systems going back to Tacitus about different traits of the Germans, Romans, and Celts, and the innumerable subdivisions with separate names. In addition, there was the biblical division into Semite, Hamitic, and Japhetic, meaning the sons of Noah, which overlapped one more. The visual, red, yellow, black, and white. Using the latter scheme loosely, Comte de Gobineau published in the 1850s a 2-volume work on the inequality of races. It dealt more with the cultures than with races, being an early cry of alarm about the fate of the West high civilization. It would perish by the admixture of the yellow and black races folkways. Not widely read until much later, it then gave the word. Not all who argued about race for the same solemn fictions, but almost educated Westerners believed in the root idea that race equals character, who reaffirmed the human race, right? But this was not specifically before that in the West, or especially in the East. So you can see how all of these terms, right, construct the framework of how we see reality. But many of them, but these are the ones we've mentioned here, are 19th century inventions or concepts, or constructed at this time. Century of not just Protestant denominations, but religious movements that moved themselves out of the category of even being Protestant anymore, because of their denial of the Trinitarian faith, the Trinitarian belief of God, with trying to define.
Father, we might not have had in the Bible, you have the Galileans, or you have the Samaritans, or you had...
But it didn't mean what we think of as race. The concept of a race of people is a modern concept, right? To be an Israelite, right, had nothing to do, or had little to do, with your ethnic background in the time of Moses. He led the Israelites out of Egypt because they participated in the Passover. You were an Israelite because you participated in the Passover sacrifice, and you were led out, right? Caleb was not of the descent of Abraham at all, but he was an Israelite because of his participation in the ritual life of Israel.
So it was religion that defined you.
Well, in that sense, it was your participation in the ritual life of the people, ancestors, that was definitive. And so people would have nothing to do with what you looked like. It meant what allegiance you held to what empire, right? Because there were the Persians, right? And you could be a member of the Persian society, right? And it had nothing to do per se with your ethnic background.
So when we're talking about racism, racist being defined now, it's according to how you look.
Well,
or
yeah.
Where you come from.
Yeah, genetics, appearance, skin color. These again, because of the scientific revolution, you have a new way of classifying things. And that's really what we're seeing the fruition of, is a scientific way of thinking and classifying. And that's where this idea of polytheism and monotheism and religion and being able to classify different religions and the kind of religions they are. This is all following the thinking of the scientific revolution, of the way of analyzing that comes out of the scientific revolution. So it hits not just biology and physics and so forth, but history, people, and so forth, and this desire to classify and delineate, right, based on observation. But that's not how people thought.